Hello, my name's Henry Farini. I'm Creative Director of the Gloucester Writers Center. Today I'm honored to support the book launch of Frances Kerry Sullivan's A Long Triage, Part 1, Welcome to the War. Since 2013, Cape Ann Veterans Services and the Gloucester Writers Center have supported a writing program. The workshop invites veterans and their family members from all wars to participate in the writing process. Today, I'd like to introduce Dorothy Shubo Nelson, who mentors the Veterans Writing Workshop and will introduce Kerry. Dorothy has taught writing and literature as a senior lecturer at UMass Boston, associate professor at Boston Conservatory, an instructor at the Tufts Summer Writing Program for high school students, and is a founding member of the Gloucester Writers Center. In 2017, Dorothy edited The Inner Voice and the Outer World, Writings by Veterans and Their Families. In this collection, we first hear the voice of our guest, Gloucester veteran Frances Kerry Sullivan. Dorothy?
Frances Kerry Sullivan graduated from Rockport High School in 1966. He was drafted into the U.S. Army in March 1968 and served in Vietnam from September 1968 until October 1969. Like other Vietnam veterans, he felt burdened by the disrespect of some of the protesters in the 1960s and 70s and moved to Australia. After he returned to the U.S., he graduated from Salem State College, taught school, married, raised a family, and became an attorney. A Long Triage, Part 1, Welcome to the War, by Frances Sullivan, is a courageous and groundbreaking contribution to American literature. Courageous because the stories reveal aspects of U.S. military culture that are hidden from civilians. Dehumanizing treatment by superiors, abusive language, violence, sleep and food deprivation. It's a groundbreaking book in ways that include the recognition that even 1 year in the midst of a war zone defined by almost constant explosions, requiring hypervigilance, can cause physical, mental, and emotional harm and repercussions for one's entire life. Kerry's book exposes the realities of a military culture that values combat troops more than support troops and forces who protect them at great risk. Rank and status seem to be valued at times more than valor, dedication, honesty, intelligence, and insight. But the military has been one of the first places in this country where social justice issues have been contested, including race, the place of women, and diverse sexual orientation. In some cases, these reforms have sparked changes in society. This book could be one that brings about change in the way servicemen and women treat each other and are dealt with by those of higher rank in basic training and throughout their careers. It could also have an effect on the polarizing culture we live in now. The physical connection. In his widely respected book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma, Bessel van der Kolk describes the damage caused by bodily trauma during war and its effects on the mind, brain, and emotions. Kerry brings these issues to life in his work of creative nonfiction. He tells these stories clearly and to the point. He is not exploitive of his subject, nor does he oversimplify health and ethical issues. He respects the reader and shares the information that we need to know. His journey to recovery from these harsh experiences, which address the enlightened methods of narrative therapy, has culminated in this book, which you will want to share with others. It is available at both Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I will now introduce Kerry Sullivan, who will begin reading from his book. And at some point, he will introduce Henry Farini to do some reading, and then Adam Kukuru, the director of Cape Ann Veteran Services, will also do some reading. And then Kerry will read some more from his book.
Thank you, Dorothy. And thank you, Adam and Henry, for participating and giving me this opportunity. For our readings today, we've shortened and rearranged excerpts from the book to provide a feel for the entire text within the time frame that we have. I'd also like to share with you my perception of a certain level of tribal type animosity that existed within the ranks of the soldiers during my time in the military. It continues to haunt me even now, many years later, because it's the same kind of antagonism that currently exists in our society between different groups of people. Chapter 1 opens my story with a short summary of my tour of duty in Vietnam. They called us rear echelon motherfuckers, even when they knew our names. Remps for short. Not all of them, but enough of them to piss me off. They were no different than the schoolyard bullies I fought against when I was a kid. They were the grunts, infantry soldiers, fighting in the worst conditions of combat. We were the troops providing them with the support they needed for their missions. But we weren't one of them, so they treated us like shit. They were jealous of us because we had more creature comforts at our bases of operation than they had out in the bush. Beds, showers, and hot food, just to name a few. And their lives were more often in more obvious danger than ours. But I refused to accept their derisive attitude towards us. We were all soldiers serving our country during America's war in Vietnam, and we were supposed to be brothers in arms fighting for a common cause in support of our nation. I'm going to jump forward by more than 40 years to January 14th. The last thing I remember before waking up in a hospital bed surrounded by a team of doctors was eating lunch at a restaurant with a group of my fellow court-appointed attorneys. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I excused myself from the table, left the restaurant, sat in my car, and answered the call. It was Annie, a probation officer who I worked with on a regular basis. I was used to the way she acted with superiority over court-appointed attorneys, but this time her attitude was unacceptable. "Attorney Sullivan," she said, "I wish you hadn't gone to lunch. It's Friday and I have the afternoon off." "Annie, I went to lunch at the close of morning session like everybody else." "Well, I'm going to ask the judge to send your client back to jail before I leave. I've got plans for the rest of the day and I can't wait for you to get back here. I'll get someone else to cover the case." "I can be there in a half an hour." "Don't bother rushing back to court for this case. It will be done before you get here." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. An image of her pale, freckled face with the map of Ireland written all over it, surrounded by her fiery red hair, flashed in front of me. It was the grunts versus the rimps all over again. "Bullshit," I screamed into the phone. "You're violating my client's constitutional right to counsel," I shouted at the top of my lungs. "Not really. He'll have an attorney, but he has a right to his own attorney, and that's me. Take it up with the judge when you get here." When she said that, I tasted anger burning my throat. The fluttering and whistling of rockets and mortars punctured my ears. A pain exploded in my head like a bomb and traveled through my blood vessels and my nerves to my stomach. I became nauseous, began vomiting profusely, and everything went black. I woke up a couple of days later, lying in the hospital bed. Bright fluorescent ceiling lights blurred my vision, and the noise in the room was ear-splitting. But I could hear the doctors talking to my wife, Patty, and my daughter, Keisha. "Mrs. Sullivan, when he arrived by ambulance, his brain was hemorrhaging, So we performed an emergency craniotomy and evacuated an actively bleeding subdural hematoma. Do you know how he hit his head? My wife responded, as far as I know, he didn't hit his head. This whole thing came out of nowhere. The doctor asked, why do you say that? When his friends called and told me he was being brought to the hospital, they said he had been eating lunch and with them and just stepped outside to answer a phone call. One of his friends went to see why he was taking so long and found him unconscious sitting behind the wheel of his car. So he called 911. It's a good thing he did. He saved his life. Spontaneous subdural hematomas can be fatal. Patty said, will he recover? We'll have to wait and see. He had an adverse reaction to the anesthesia. As the anesthesia wore off, he was in a state of delirium, screaming incoherently. What was he screaming about? She asked. Something about rimps and grunts, incoming rockets and mortars, and gooks coming through the wire. I'm not surprised. He does that when he wakes up from his nightmares about Vietnam. How long has that been going on? The doctor asked. Patty said, as long as I've known him. He was diagnosed with PTSD 20 years ago, went through a psychotic break and tried to kill himself. Then 10 years later, he had a similar episode when he had open heart surgery. As a result of these conditions, the doctors prescribed all kinds of medications for me to take for a variety of reasons. But the one that concerned me the most was Dilantin. Evidently, seizures were a possible side effect as a result of my brain surgery. Then a psychiatrist was added to my team of caregivers. My rehabilitation and recovery included physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy for my brain injury and the symptoms of stroke. And psychotherapy was added to help me with my PTSD. My goal became threefold. Not only would I need to overcome my physical symptoms, I needed to get the reality of my experiences during the war into focus and purge myself of some deep-seated anger. I'm going to stop here, and Henry and Adam are going to read part of my book for me. Thank you.
As we entered the hooch, Jared said, this is a bummer, Sully, but you might as well know why a bunk is available in our hooch. A few days before you got here, me and Zebraman were sent out to LZ Green Haven to operate a mobile radio van where the regular crew, while the regular crew went on R&R. But he didn't make it back with me. I felt horrible hearing this. I said nothing as I walked in and saw a group of guys sitting around passing a pipe to one another. His friends, who had all been in country for about 6 months, were in the middle of an improvised requiem ceremony in his honor. Apparently, Zebraman had been a pot smoker. As they passed around the pot pipe, each person took a hit and said a few words of respect and remembrance. When Jared got the pipe, he held it for a long time and gave a eulogy. He began by saying, Carlos Encineas was his name, but to us, he was Zebraman. He took a drag from the pipe before continuing. He lived in New Mexico before joining the Army right out of high school. He served in Korea and was older than the rest of us enlisted men in Vietnam, but he was our soulmate. We called him Zebraman because he earned and lost his sergeant's stripes many times, protecting us from poor decisions made by officers who live and work in those air-conditioned vans surrounding their big, important command control bunker. All while we sweat like pigs, sleeping under nets, hiding from mosquitoes. We paused for a moment of silence. I looked around the room, taking note of where everything was. On both sides of the center aisle, there are 4 sections clearly separated by their contents. From front to back, each area had a bunk beneath a metal frame holding up a mosquito net. A standard olive green metal foot locker sat at the floor next to the bunk. There was a passageway in the middle, and the area separated the locker and the bunk from a tall standing locker at the end. Pictures of family and friends were taped on the lockers, along with a few Playboy pinup posters, sports paraphernalia. I was impressed about how clean the place looked, considering it was occupied by 8 young men. When the moment of silence ended, Jared continued with his eulogy. Zebra Man's last and final effort to protect his men should earn him a Medal of Honor. We were sent out of the bush to help a group of South Vietnamese soldiers strengthen their defenses on a hill we all knew was a lost cause. It had been taken and abandoned many times by both sides of this useless war. The fire base was on high alert, and the scouts were out observing enemy troop movements in the valley below. Jared paused again and appeared to be shaking a little as he wiped away tears running over his cheeks. His voice crackled as he went on to say, before dawn, on the day Zebra Man was killed, 3 infantry soldiers were outside the perimeter on a hotel pad below us. We began taking small arms fire. Zebra Man sent me to the pack of radios and prepared the van to be airlifted off the hill so the gooks wouldn't get the equipment. Jared wiped another tear and continued. The gooks appeared on the hill above us and began a downward assault with automatic weapons, rockets, and mortars. Shrapnel was showering down on all of us. I finished packing the van, jumped in, and was ready for the airlift. Zebra Man screamed at the 3 grunts, run for the van and jump in, and I'll set a hook for the airlift. The grunts ran like hell, jumped into the van with me, and the helicopter swooped in. Zebra Man leapt through the air. As he set the hook, he was shot in the back by a sniper. His body fell to the ground, and the chopper flew away with me and the grunts safely inside. After hearing such a story, I didn't dare refuse the invitation to join the ceremony. As Jared finished, he passed the pipe to me and said, welcome to Vietnam, Sully. You never met Zebra Man, but I'm sure he would appreciate a few words of respect from the cherry taking over his bunk. God rest your soul, Zebra Man. And I took my very first hit of marijuana. I passed the pipe to a guy next to me. The daze covered me like a blanket of fog. Started coughing, tried to sit down slowly. I somehow stumbled into my new bunk and passed out.
About an hour later, someone came through the hooch, calling out for those of us who had guard duty to get our asses in gear and make it to the guard formation over by the water tank immediately. I grabbed my gear, ran over to the water tank, and just made it to formation in time for my name to be called by the sergeant in charge of the bunkers of the perimeter surrounding the base, and I fell in line. Right here, Sergeant. He checked my weapon, ammunition pouches, eyeballed my uniform and said, not bad for a cherry. We were ordered to load the guard truck with a variety of ammo boxes. Some contained extra rounds for our M16s, some contained flares, and some contained grenades. Before we climbed aboard, the sergeant said, seeing that we have a few new cherries here today, I'll give a short review. He paused for a moment and looked around to make sure we were all paying attention to him. When he was satisfied, he went on with his review. For obvious reasons, bullets, flares, and grenades are stored in separate ammo boxes. Any questions? No response from anybody. Only use flares to light up the area if you suspect the enemy is attempting to penetrate the perimeter. If he is, it's probably sappers trying to crawl through the wire. It takes them so long to get through. You'll have time to call the DTOC on your field phone. He paused again and looked around, eyeballing the cherries, like we were idiots. Only throw grenades if you receive confirmation from an officer that we are in fact having an attempted penetration of the perimeter. Several short timers complained. That's bullshit, Sarge. We need to defend ourselves any way we can. You guys know you don't need to call in for permission to shoot the enemy with your rifles if you are actually seeing the fuckers. At all times, defend yourselves with your M16s. As the sergeant's review was coming to an end, out of the corner of my eye, I could see one of the guys climbing into the truck. He must have been a cherry like me, because his hair was still a military crew cut, and his uniform was pressed and spotless. I figured, like me, it must be his first time going out to the bunker line. I never did get his name, but he made a lasting impression on me that continues to haunt me. I could sense something wasn't quite right. He was fidgeting with the ammo boxes and squinting his eyes in the sun while staring at something he had in his hands, like he had never seen this stuff before. As it turns out, he had a couple ammo cans open and was looking through them. I heard the sergeant of the guard scream at him, "You idiot, put those things down." The guy stopped immediately, and the sergeant made him do push-ups and finish loading the truck with supplies by himself. The rest of us started loading our personal gear and began climbing into the truck. But I heard a sizzling sound as I was about to sit down and give a helping hand to one of the guys. He must have heard the same noise. He had a frightened look on his face as he pulled me backwards with a tight grip of my wrist and yelled, "Jump!" As most of us jumped out of the truck and landed flat ass in the dirt, an extremely loud explosion went off like a bomb. Shattered truck parts flew through the smoke-filled air, landing all around us, and a merciful screaming vibrated through the atmosphere. I turned around and looked. I couldn't believe what I saw. I was grossed out and felt like throwing up. The cherry that had loaded the truck was now missing the lower part of both of his legs. A couple of short timers, both experienced infantrymen, had the wherewithal to grab their web belts and apply tourniquets to both legs on the wounded soldier. The rest of the cherries stood around dumbstruck, waiting for the sergeant to tell us what to do. We were in a state of shock, with squeamish, puke-ready looks on our faces, but afraid to say anything in front of the experienced short-timers. We were fearful of the dreaded question, "What are you, a remp?" The sergeant got on his radio and called for the medics. When he was through, he lectured us about the consequences of making stupid mistakes. He said, "That dummy must have mixed flares and grenades in the same ammo box. One of the caps on the flares probably loosened and ignited, setting off the grenades." As shocking and unsettling as the experience was, we had a job to do. We hiked over to the motor pool, requisitioned another truck, and got it loaded with troops, equipment, and ammunition. The sergeant of the guard drove us along the utility road Danny had shown me during our grand tour of Chulai. We arrived at the bunker line before dark to relieve the guys who had been on daytime guard duty. Only 2 guys per bunker were on duty for day guard. As we picked them up, we were dropped off in groups of 3 for the night guard.
Thank you, Adam. I'm going to jump back to 2014 again. The hospital that I was in was not properly equipped to handle patients with delirium. Not all the staff had been properly trained to accommodate a patient requiring sensory deprivation therapy. The environment surrounding me was too busy and too noisy. I felt like I was stuck in a subway station with no idea of where to go. When the nurses and other staff members came into my room, they would turn on the lights and leave the door open. I could hear the conversations of people in the hallway, clear down to the nurses' station that was at the end of a long hollow tunnel. People came in and out of my room all day and night, waking me up to check my vital signs, and would forget to close the door and turn off the lights as they left. Because I was under doctor's orders not to get out of bed without assistance, I'd press the call button for someone to come back and turn off the lights and close the door. But by the time someone came back to my room, it would be time for more invasive procedures to my body, and the irritating cycle would start all over again. So I went without sleep for several days at a time, remained in an agitated state, continually engaged in arguments with the staff. Throughout that time, all I could think about was getting out of there. After several more days of enduring this egregious and unhealthy environment, a friendly doctor with a soothing voice came into my room and introduced himself as Dr. Ransing. His appearance caught me off guard. I went into a kind of mental tailspin. I thought I was looking at some hippie from back in the 60s. He was a handsome guy, about 6 feet tall and thin. He was probably in his early 30s. He had a noticeably round face, a dark complexion that was almost mahogany in color, and the large round eyes I've always associated with people from India. The hippie look came from his kurta, a traditional shirt worn by people in his Eastern culture. I remember seeing the followers of the Hare Krishna movement in radical hippies wearing the same clothes like he was wearing back in the days of the anti-war protests that were going all around America. I sat there like a zombie, staring at him with a blank look on my face, thinking about how the protesters had sabotaged my return home. I don't know how long he waited for me to respond, but when I came to my senses, he was no longer in the room. While I was eating breakfast the next day, there was someone knocking on the door to my room. While I was eating, "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan. It's Dr. Ransing. We met yesterday. I'm the psychiatrist that has been assigned to be in charge of your treatment team. May I come in?" "Yes, of course. Nice to meet you, Dr. Ransing. Good morning to you too. Sorry about blanking out yesterday. How do you feel this morning?" "Disoriented." "That's understandable considering the circumstances." "What do you mean, Doc?" "Mr. Sullivan, you just survived brain surgery, which is a serious operation for anybody to undergo. And seeing that you had an adverse reaction to the anesthesia and emerged from it in a state of delirium with the symptoms of stroke, I was not surprised by your catatonic state yesterday. Now we are scheduling you for speech therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy for your medical conditions, and on a daily basis in your home for several months. But we're recommending narrative therapy for your PTSD. What does that actually mean, narrative therapy? I've been through about every type of therapy for PTSD that there is. Yes, I know you have, but now you will be also dealing with the symptoms of traumatic brain injury. So how is this going to be any different than those other therapeutic programs? The doctor was nice enough to spend time explaining that the other programs were structured around the person being a problem. But in narrative therapy, the patient is not seen as the problem. The events in the patient's life that trigger the psychotic breaks are seen as the problems. He recommended that I write a narrative about my memories of serving in Vietnam. He assured me that the experience would be therapeutic because it would let me see the events that happened there as separate from me. As a result, he said, I would develop a better understanding of the problems that I was having in the past. And he said that with the help of the treatment team, I could learn to control my reactions to events that may startle me in the future. He asked me to continue writing at home after I was discharged from the hospital, and that when I was finished, to schedule an appointment at his outpatient clinic and bring my work with me when I came for my first appointment. Thank you for listening.
Kerry, thank you for such a strong reading. It's very powerful. And thank you, Adam and Henry, for participating. It was great to hear your voices being brought to this terrific book. I wanted to close out by asking Kerry just one question. You mentioned the importance of narrative therapy and make it very clear what a great contribution this kind of therapy is. But what about the other therapies? What was some of your experience with these other therapies?
Great question, Dorothy. The first helpful therapy that I had was called cognitive restructuring. Basically, you can narrow that therapy down to a phrase that sounds kind of silly, but it's true. If you don't like what's going on in your life, you need to think about the way that you think and change something that gives you a result that you would like to have, rather than continue with the same kind of behavior that was making you unhappy. It was very helpful, but it didn't do the whole trick. And then I went through other things. One of them was called present sense therapy. Other ones had to do with using computers, and you stare at a screen and they monitor your brain. I think the thing that bothered me about the other ones was that I always felt like I was like a guinea pig, that they were more interested not in me as an individual, but statistically, what is going on in order to support their grant money in the research foundations. And it was too scientific. And when I began the narrative therapy with Dr. Ransing and Dr. Jones, who will be mentioned later in the book, who took over for Dr. Ransing, the whole idea of seeing the bothersome events separate from yourself made more sense than filling out worksheets or having questions that were more robotic than just the free flow, almost like a James Joyce experience, the stream of consciousness. And it's not over. The narrative therapy will probably, for me, continue for the rest of my life.
As we talk about therapies, the writers group is a form of therapy for a lot of our veterans. And we've seen that, and Dorothy can attest to that, what writing has done for some of our veterans that have struggled to make a connection to their past experiences and relate it on paper. It's been an amazing group, the Cape Ann Writers Group, and not only has it provided that therapeutic process, but it's left a legacy for our community and an educational tool. So hopefully down the road, our nation won't make the same mistakes that we've made, or we've really considered the long-term effects that we are having on our military servicemen and women, that when we send them to war, it's not for just the duration of the war, but it's for the lifetime of that individual, that they are living and reliving these experiences. And I think your book does a great job of talking about that and relating your time in Vietnam and then bringing it back to your current day struggles, both medically and physically. And this is a lifetime of therapy that goes on, and it's something that we as a nation need to consider when we consider sending our youth into conflicts.
It's been a great pleasure to be part of this project. Thank you so much, everybody.